Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast in association with eBay Motors Group. It is Saturday, the 11th of July, and you're joined by myself, Philip Nothard.
And me, Curtis Hutchinson. So we think this is episode 365. So, welcome aboard this morning.
It's a bit like we think it's Saturday the 11th as well. It's kind of days and months and blurring into each other at the minute, aren't they? But busy.
Yeah, well, we're all leading accelerated weeks, aren't we? Because we were just saying that it was only last week that we had Clive Brook on the show, but that seems like a long time ago. And I must add that we've had a lot of interest in that Clive Brook interview, a lot of activity on social media, lots of likes and shares and forwards. So, it's probably another opportunity to plug it again. So do revisit that interview because it really was fascinating, I thought.
Definitely. I mean, very open, very transparent, and we followed up with the Rob Lindley interview, and actually I think he referred to the Clive Brook interview on his, and sort of referencing some of the notes that he'd made and pointers about making his showroom look more like a VIP event rather than a crime scene and things like that, wasn't it? So it was the interview has gone down, as you say, really well, and such a nice gentleman and very transparent and cracking result in June. He had some outstanding performance results in June, didn't he, once the restrictions were lifted.
Yeah, absolutely right. And as you mentioned, Rob Lindley, he's the UK boss of Mitsubishi, and he's our interviewee this week. And do stay on at the end of this podcast because we'll run the interview then. But that was a good interview, very wide-ranging, and with Rob talking about the impact of the lockdown on the brand as a distributor and the network, but also the way that the restarts panned out, and strong after sales performance, and also he does talk about why he's not unnecessarily concerned about stock levels, which I thought was particularly interesting.
Yeah, and he's got such a career history, hasn't he, as well? I mean, he's from some of the previous roles, positions that he's held throughout his lifetime, and obviously being involved with the Harley Davidson brand as well, which is it's quite an interesting background and experience that he's had in the sector. So stay tuned to the end of this headlines to listen to the Rob Lindley interview if you've not heard it already. So we have got a good mix of headlines because obviously we've had the new car results out this week as well, haven't we, for June? So we've got a good mix of things, and the restrictions continue to be lifted in certain areas as well.
Yeah. So as you say, we've got the car and van results for June. We've got an interesting update from the IMI about some data that they've looked at in regards to what the sector has been doing throughout June and in terms of reopening, and also some sort of revenue forecast there. So we'll have a look at that. Test drives. Accompanied test drives are back on the agenda because it's only a couple of weeks ago that we were talking about how that they were now unaccompanied, but the rules have changed as rules are changing on a daily and weekly basis. So we've got an update there. And we've also got two acquisitions to talk about. So, plenty to cover this week.
Yeah, and an unfortunate one at the end there with potential loss of potential jobs that were going to be for the UK and may not be now. So a bit of a change in strategy as we last story of this week, haven't we? So better get on with this first one. So the eagerly awaited sort of first results since particularly the showrooms opened in England on the 1st of June, followed swiftly by Ireland, Wales, and then Scotland. And we had the figures through, didn't we, for June, and this is in AM online. And new car sales reach 145,377 in the first month from COVID-19 lockdown. And I think this is probably a better than expected figure with the pent up demand and activity out there than many probably anticipated. I know that we at Cox Automotive forecast sort of a medium output of about 50%, and to be fair, up until 24 hours to the end of the month, it was looking like that. But as usual, a little bit of tactical registration activity in the last sort of day. Administrators across the network getting last minute phone calls to do some deals. But reality is that's what happened last year in June as well. So no different, I think, this year.
Yeah, I mean, some things never change.
No. It does happen. I mean, in the morning of the last day, I think the figures were looking like they were about 45% down year on year, and then came in at 34.9. So there was activity. We probably expected that there would be activity because we spoke about it for some time on this podcast, haven't we, Curtis? That there's cars on the ground and the manufacturers, as the interviews that we've done, are keen to get those vehicles registered.
Yeah, my take on this story was, yes, the market for the month was down 35%, which was nowhere near as bad as the previous month. And let's not forget that these figures for June really do just reflect England, Northern Ireland, a bit of Wales, and only a tiny bit of Scotland, because Scotland only reopened within the last couple of days of the month. But looking at the press release that the SMMT put out, and Mike Hawes, chief exec there, is a lot more hawkish than a lot of people, because he's saying, and he's quoting the story here, that this is not a recovery. This is not a recovery and barely a restart. So I think he's sort of managing expectations there. And we'll come on to Mike a bit later about the VAT cuts and how that wasn't rolled out across the automotive sector this week. So we will revisit that. But looking at we won't look at the winners and losers for this month because basically everyone's down. But there are a couple of notable exceptions. So Bentley were up. They were up 8.5%. Lexus were up 13.3%. MG, they were up 88%. Smart up 30%. Toyota up 2.7%. And Toyota's a particularly interesting one because for the month, they sold 11,709 vehicles, which actually outperformed Mercedes, BMW, Audi, and Vauxhall, which in normal times that just wouldn't happen. So there's still some interesting dynamics powering the market at the moment.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, referring back to the interview that's at the end of this show, but Rob, obviously, in terms of from a Mitsubishi perspective, the dynamics of how some of these manufacturers were affected in the lockdown on the 23rd of March, because some of the manufacturers, in terms of the way their vehicles are registered, some are very front end focused and some are back end focused, and I think those that are back end focused in March were the ones that lost out a little bit in March but had products ready to go in early June when restrictions were lifted. But you do make a very valid point there about, obviously, the Wales and Scotland not being fully operational for the full month of June. And I think when you start to compare the UK with some of our European partners, with France actually went up in the month of June by 1.2%. with 233,000 registrations, which is actually, I think, what we registered last June in the UK was about that figure. So they actually increased. Germany dropped 32.3%, similar to ourselves, and Italy, they were down 23.1%. So very mixed bag across those European markets, but obviously the standout one there being France, interestingly enough, with that increase. And there weren't many across the international global market that actually increased. China did, US did, and interestingly Korea were the highest performer at 41.2% increase in the month of June, but the majority did drop year on year. So, some interesting results there.
Yeah, and really, as far as the UK goes, July will be the real test,
It
because
will.
that'll be when all the countries that make up the UK were open. And even in this story, there's a mention that 1 in 5 showrooms in England remain shut throughout June. So this doesn't reflect the true size of the market. July will.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, the performance was in private, because private was only down 19.2%. The significant drop was in both fleet, 45.2% down, and business, 52.6% down. So again, reflecting some of the conversations we've been having about that rental, leasing, contract hire market that haven't been active, and many have cancelled their stocks for the year so far with the manufacturers. So again, retail seems to have held up reasonably well, all considered.
Yes.
20,000 units down, 18,000 units down, and that was without a full month from Wales and Scotland. So interesting results. So moving on and going across to Motor Trader, and some very interesting stats here that have been published by the IMI, and the header is that automotive getting back on its feet as majority of businesses open, says at IMI. And these are some stats that Steve Nash, who's the CEO from IMI, has published in Motor Trader. What's your thoughts around this? Because there's some big numbers there and some interesting numbers.
There are, yeah. So, as you say, this is based on data released by the ONS that the IMI has looked at. And let's just have a look at some of the stats here. So, 8% of businesses reopened, equating to approximately 7,500 businesses. 4%, which equates to 3,300, plan to open in the first 2 weeks of July, and 3% of organisations with a workforce of more than 250 are still temporarily closed, compared to 10% of those with a workforce of less than 250. So this is a moving feast, but it goes on to say that approximately 219,000 jobs across the sector remain on furlough. So there's lots to play out here.
Yeah, and say Steve, he's talking that he's tremendously encouraged to see how determined our sector has been in getting back on its feet since the 1st of June, which is when the showroom opened. But just 8%, as you say, they're not reopened, and 62,000 jobs returned to work from furlough. So I think there's been a few interesting interviews this week on some of the platforms and webinars about some of the leading CEOs talking about the potential drop in staffing levels across the network and closures. So I think there's still a lot to play out, isn't there, with so many still on furlough and things like that. So I think we'll keep a close eye on this one. But again, good investigation there by the IMI.
Yeah, next story is from Car Dealer, and the headline is "Accompanied car test drives are back on after social distancing rules relaxed." So this is really based on comments from Logistics, the Most Trade legal firm, who have looked at the new rules applied to driving instructors and driving tests, which were restarted from 4th of July. And Logistics are basically saying that the same rules now apply to test drives, which can be accompanied once more. So quoting Nona Balkas from Logistics, one of the solicitors there, saying, "Since lockdown, customers and dealerships have had to get used to unaccompanied test drives." And this is what I found interesting. She goes on to say, while some have found this a positive, with many customers preferring to be able to go out in the car without the sales talk, others, however, have decided it was too much of a risk, especially in those cases where they could not obtain the appropriate insurance cover. So it makes you wonder how many customers deferred a test drive because it was just too risky. They didn't want to do it, so they will feel safer being accompanied.
Yeah, I think I mean, the industry's always, you have looked at people before and they're happy for them to go out on a test drive on their own, and as you say, as long as the documentation and paperwork's correct and everything else. But that it was always a case that some consumers just didn't want a salesperson sat next to them, as you put, doing the sales patter there, I suppose, as they are driving. But again, there is a risk with that, for obvious reasons. So it's a good move. I think at least then dealers, the retailers, and the consumer now have the choice. They can either continue doing the unaccompanied test drive as long as paperwork and both the retailer and the consumer are happy doing that, or they can go down the line of accompanied test drive as long as they follow the rules. And to get a bit of context behind this, we did look up about the guidance behind the driving lessons, and it was quite simple rules really. There wasn't a great deal to it. It was a case of wearing clothes that cover both your arms and legs, wearing face coverings and disposable gloves to be changed after each lesson, keeping windows down throughout the lesson. I think someone may feel say that could be an issue in the last week or two that we've had with the rain in the UK.
Yes.
But,
yeah.
And that the pupils will be asked to wash their hands before each lesson and wear a face mask. So really, very, very simple rules. And like you say, the similar being applied to test drives now. So again, it'll be interesting to get a view from a retailer in maybe a week or two's time and just see how that's gone down and how it's been operated in a real life environment, as between the customers and the retailers. But we'll have a look at that one.
Yes, so you're listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast in association with eBay Motors Group, the only weekly podcast serving the car retailing sector, and available online at motortraderadio.com and by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Deezer, and SoundCloud.
So remaining with Car Dealer, and this links nicely again, I'm afraid, with the interview at the end with Rob Lindley from Mitsubishi. But this is talking about dealers and manufacturers must now incentivise buyers who were holding off for scrappage scheme or VAT cut. And we did pose that question to Rob, didn't we, on the interview, that what his thoughts were, and it was on the day of we interviewed him on the day of the announcement. And sadly, I think there was a view that scrappage wasn't going to happen anyway. But I think people were hoping that there'd be something that was announced to support the sector. And unfortunately, it hasn't really in any way, has there? Because the VAT doesn't hit the sector, and I think there's a view here that it's now what probably David Peel mentioned from PSA Peugeot, and Rob did as well, that now it's down to the manufacturers and the retailers to put their own incentives together to entice consumers to not put off their purchase any longer. No.
Yeah, and I guess the only positive to come out of this, because it was disappointing for the sector that they didn't benefit from the VAT cut, but at least we now know with some clarity and surety that there won't be a scrappage scheme, there won't be a market stimulus, and now any customers who may have been deferring their purchase until an announcement was made can now go ahead and buy, because they know, well, if it's publicised well enough, they will now know there won't be a scrappage scheme or a stimulus package. So no need to defer those purchases in the hope that there will be.
Yeah, and that was the point with it, wasn't it, on the interview, that whilst there is a possibly and a hopefully hanging around, some consumers will put off their purchase. And Mike Hawes is quoted in the release, who's the SMMT chief exec, that he said it was bitterly disappointing that the Chancellor stopped short of supporting the automotive industry yesterday. The trade body has been lobbying for a scrappage scheme or a VAT cut to boost car sales, and as we know, that hasn't happened. But as you say, it's a case of moving on now. Manufacturers obviously in writing our first story there. As last minute registrations are obviously keen to get those vehicles registered. We referenced the 18,000 drop in the private registration, so private demand seems to have held up year on year better than obviously business. I think there's a job now to do to stimulate both the business and fleet sector, and try and maintain that private sector now from the manufacturers into it. I think from the announcement.
And yeah, definitely. And to give some added context to that, within this story, there's some analysis of some research that What Car magazine did. They polled 6,000 would-be car buyers last week and found that 33% of them were holding off in the hope of a scrappage scheme or some sort of incentive program. So they are active in-market buyers who hopefully will come into the market from July onwards now.
Definitely. So in AM Online, so we're moving over to a couple of acquisitions that both have been covered by AM Online. And the first one is that TMS Motor Group acquires Sandycliff Kia Leicester car dealership. I wonder if the Leicester dealership knew, because it was on lockdown, wasn't it, at the minute? So
it was, and there's a lovely quote here from TMS Managing Director Len Hallows talking to AM. He about his decision to acquire the business in the current climate, and whilst Leicester is on lockdown, and he said, "I don't think many can quite fathom whether I'm shrewd or silly, but I'm not stupid. This was the right move for us at this point in time." So great comment there from Len. And also to give that a bit of context, this will increase TMS's representation with Kia to 2 sites, because they already represent Kia in nearby Hinckley. So you get those economies of scale and the geographical locations there. So it makes absolute perfect sense. And TMS, they have grown through acquisition recently. So they also represent Volvo, and they bought a Volvo site also in Leicester last year from Sturgis, and now have 3 Volvo sites to go with their 2 Kia sites. So interesting timing, but it is good news, and the story does say that the staff have been taken on with the acquisition.
Yeah, and it's great because we talk about digital propositions and things like that, but it does make a reference to the fact that they did invest in a platform that allows them to do a full end-to-end online retail. So I think that's probably referring to the fact that Leicester's on lockdown. So even though he has taken on the business, he is still able to operate in the digital space with that end-to-end proposition that they have online. So great news. I mean, it is good news that there is acquisitions still taking place in the current tough climate, should we say? And that's
speaking of which, we've got another one, haven't we?
Yeah, Peter Cooper Motor Group expands into Dorset with Think Cars acquisition, and basically Peter Cooper Motor Group has expanded into Dorset with the acquisition of a £14 million turnover Think Cars SsangYong and used car dealership. So again, a great move for SsangYong there, because we haven't spoke a great deal about SsangYong on the podcast, have we? And they're quietly growing a little bit. There's a few acquisitions taking place across the SsangYong network, and again, a great little move for these guys, because they operate predominantly in Volkswagen UK franchises across Chichester, Portsmouth, Hedge End and Southampton. So again, a move into Dorset there for them.
Yeah, no, this is a very good move. And you mentioned SsangYong there. SsangYong were actually one of the brands that increased their share in June. So their registrations were actually up 30%. So yes, probably a good time for Peter Cooper to add SsangYong to their portfolio. But they're a good business, and as you say, they've got strong representation with Volkswagen across the south coast, and it does make sense for them to expand into Dorset. So it'd be interesting to see where we go from here. This particular story it is of interest, worth having a look at, because it does actually talk about other deals that were completed during the pandemic. And by way of a recap, because we have covered these over the last couple of months, they include Brayley Cars acquiring Glyn Hopkins Romford Honda dealership. That was last month, and also Richmond Motor Group's acquisition of Newman's Southampton. So another acquisition there on the south coast.
Yeah, exactly. And finally, we've got this week, and this is at Auto Express, and there's been a bit of a debate in the social space on this week, and it's a bit of a disappointment but an understanding at the same time with it, and this is the Ineos Automotive business that are now saying they could ditch the Welsh factory and buy a smart plant in France, and this is where there's a proposition from the Daimler over in France there that they've offered Ineos the opportunity to take their plant on over in France rather than take the Bridgend business that they'd planned to take on in Wales there, the ex-Ford plant. And I mean, we talked about this just before the show, didn't we? Because it was a done deal, I think, wasn't it? This one in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously hugely disappointing for Bridgend, because they're facing the closure of the Ford factory. They know that's happening, that's closing, and that will see the loss of 1,700 jobs. But the Ineos factory, which was moving in nearby, looks though it would create 500 jobs in the area. So that is disappointing. And let's also not forget that the car we're talking about is the Grenadier 4x4, which is very much the sort of spiritual successor to the Defender, because it looks like a Defender, albeit slightly longer.
But where's got that design from? I can't think. Can you?
Yeah, I mean, the thinking behind the car was the old Defender had reached the end of its life cycle. Land Rover had made it clear that they weren't going to reinvest in a new generation of that sort of utility type vehicle, and this inspired Jim Ratcliffe, the British billionaire owner of Ineos, to invest in this project to, keep the Defender spirit going. But it looks though it will be made in France now.
It will be a shame, and I think that's the bit with it. I think there's the comments in social have been, it's just, they understand it. There's a factory there, ready to put it in and start building. But as you say, the fact that it is kind of the Defender replacement in a way, is a British UK billionaire, and having that vehicle being, British built, UK built, would have been a fantastic result, wouldn't it? And again, to save some of those jobs as well from Bridgend there. But I don't know. I mean, it could go either way still, couldn't it? I mean, I'm not sure that either are a done deal. I think that we have to see on this one, but I'm sure there'll be a final announcement at some point. But it's looking. I think the French have been talking about it a lot this week in their headlines, if I'm honest.
Yes, French are very pleased.
The French are very pleased that they're getting the Ineos business over there. So we'll have to just see what does come out on this one. But
and it's not too far away. I mean, bearing in mind the factory hasn't been built yet, but it's not too far away from production, because they're talking about first deliveries in 2022. So whichever way the decision goes, it's got to be made pretty soon.
Yeah, so a shame, but we'll keep a close eye on that one as it evolves. So, I mean, again, packed headlines, lots of stuff going on. acquisitions, sales, closures, redundancies, opportunities. There's so much to keep an eye on. So keep an eye on the headlines that are coming out through just some of the platforms that we've mentioned there with AM and Motor Trader, Car Dealer Mag, and BBC, and all the others that we do mention on a regular basis. But lots going on, and some fantastic interviews of late, haven't we, with Rob and Clive? I mean, both great, insightful interviews on top of the others that we've already done.
Yeah, and that is pretty much it for this week. You've been listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast, brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. As Phil says, do stay tuned for our chat with Rob Lindley. Rob is the MD of Mitsubishi UK, and it's a wide-ranging interview with Rob telling us about how the business managed its way through the lockdown, and also why the brand is better positioned than many others in terms of access to new vehicle stock. There's an interesting reason for that, so do stay tuned to find out why. He also talks about June performance and also his hopes for the brand and indeed the sector for the short to medium and long term. So stay tuned for that, but do join Phil and I again next weekend, and do look out for the latest in our series of special interviews with industry leaders and analysts. We've actually got a mega interview coming up over the coming weeks, but until that's recorded, we won't release who it's with, but that's definitely one to listen out for. So until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him. Hello and welcome from me, Philip Nothard, and Curtis Hutchinson to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. So many thanks again for joining us in this special latest series of special interviews themed around sharing best practices as car retailers manage their way through the COVID-19 crisis. Previous interviews with Sytner Group's Darren Edwards, Virtue Motors' Robert Forrester, Marshall Motors' Dash Gupta, and many others are still available to stream online from Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Motor Trade Radio.
For this episode, we're delighted to welcome to the show Rob Lindley, Managing Director of Mitsubishi Motors. So welcome to the show, Rob.
Oh, hello, Curtis. It's great to be here. As you may know, I'm a regular listener of the show and have been back in the day since I came back into the car industry a couple of years ago. So very much looking forward to joining your illustrious list of interviewees.
No, it is great to have you on, Rob, and especially as you are a regular listener. Look, by way of a quick recap of your career for listeners who've tuned in today, you started in automotive back in Ford, and do correct me if I get any of this wrong, but you started back in the late 1980s at Ford, working in the UK and Europe, before joining Mazda Motors UK in 2001 as marketing director, which is when I think we first met. So, gosh, that's nearly 20 years ago now.
Yes.
Yes. You went on to become MD. You then moved to the newly formed McLaren Automotive as Global Sales and Marketing Director, and then on to Harley-Davidson as VP and MD for Europe, Middle East and Asia, before joining Mitsubishi in April 2018 as Managing Director. So hopefully I got that right.
That's it, Curtis. It's been a colourful career, that's for sure.
Certainly has. A lot going on there, Rob, a lot going on. And interesting, the Harley-Davidson one in between there, isn't it? That's I believe, were you a biker before joining Harley-Davidson, or do you become quickly involved
I
with
became
one?
one.
Became a biker.
Became very passionate about it, actually.
Yeah, I can imagine. So I mean, welcome to the show, Rob, and fantastic that you're a listener. So hopefully we've kept you informed as well as entertained through lockdown, but welcome to the show. So there's obviously been a lot going on at the moment, and plenty to talk about, and we're starting back and taking us through sort of what's been happening in lockdown since the 23rd of March, which probably seems a long time ago now for you and those listening to the show. But do you want to talk us through some of the challenges that you faced as a leading car brand at the time when showrooms were closed, and how you kept the communications open with the dealer network?
Yeah, sure, Phil. You're right. March 23rd almost feels like another lifetime now. I actually remember on that morning we had recorded a video for the start of the next quarter's campaign, which would have been published to our dealers at the end of that week. But as you can imagine, then everything changed. The campaign that had been written became completely redundant, and we never released that video. It went in the bin. And March 24th was then my last day in the office for quite a while as we moved to working from home. And I have to be honest, I wasn't personally in a massive hurry to shut the office down because we're fairly well spaced out in Cirencester, and I had a fear that once we went into lockdown, we might be staying in that situation for quite a while. And of course, that proved to be very much true. And I don't know how it was for you guys, but other than having a couple of snow day dry run tests at the time, we really were leaping into the unknown. We didn't know how efficiently or how effectively we'd be able to operate remotely. But of course, then, like everybody else, we discovered actually it isn't really that hard. You know, we use WebEx as our visual virtual conference tool, and I think we've all adapted to that fairly well. But the big challenges that we had to deal with, first and foremost, was how to deal with uncertainty and an incredibly fast-changing situation, especially in those early days after lockdown. Like many other businesses, we went on to daily WebEx calls with our management team and weekly updates with our dealer partners. As you probably know, a lot of our Mitsubishi dealers are small local businesses, and it wasn't uncommon for the DP to stay working, but literally all the other staff were furloughed. And in that situation, you can well imagine that those dealer principals would need to get a lot of reassurance from us. So we tried to do that. Once things had stabilised a bit, we set up then a virtual dealer conference that we did over Zoom with a live Q&A, and that was back at the end of May. And we used that to lay out our plans for the rest of the year, and specifically for the new campaign period, which we made a 4-month campaign from June to September. So it was a pretty challenging time, you're right. Overall, I hope our dealers would say that we did a decent job in communicating with them during the lockdown and since, and that given, we also had to furlough quite a lot of our own staff to control our costs, that we did an okay job in supporting them and keeping in touch with them. Clearly, as an independent distributor, the last 3 months have been extremely tough on our business, and our financial year starts April and runs to the end of March. So clearly, we've got a lot of ground to make up in the year we have ahead. But it's been a challenge for sure, but it's beginning to get back to a little bit more like normality now.
And a couple of follow-up questions there, Rob. I mean, you mentioned that a lot of your network is operated by owner-drivers. So how much of the network actually stayed open for after-sales during the lockdown period? And how did you manage the fulfillment of March orders? Because, of course, the lockdown happened in what is the busiest week of the busiest month of the year. So how did the fulfillment pan out for the new reg plates?
No, that's right. So when it became clear that workshops could stay open, we fairly quickly saw around about 20 of our dealer service operations get restarted, and that's out of 111. And they were initially working mainly for essential workers. But that number then went up progressively week by week. And by the end of May, I think we had 93% of all of the workshops were back open. Our parts warehouse and distribution centre stayed open throughout the lockdown. In the early days, parts volumes, as you can imagine, were very limited, and we only had a skeleton staff. But it quickly built back up, and our P&A revenues are now up to about 80 to 90% of what they were at the same point last year. In terms of delivering March deliveries, I think our March deliveries were largely done by the dealers by fairly early on in June, and our dealers actively embraced click and collect as well. As you may have seen, actually, we've been also operating with a free home delivery offer through our Mitsubishi Buy Online platform, which during the lockdown period included also the option where a customer could secure their order with just a £99 holding deposit. Yeah. So that was quite an important feature for giving customers confidence and supporting the dealers as well. And you may know with Mitsubishi Buy Online, all of the sales are delivered through a dealer in order that the dealers engage direct with the customer as well. So it's a process very much designed to support the dealers rather than to bypass them.
And in terms of new car stock levels as they stand at the moment, how are they looking? And what's new order times? What's the timeline looking like for people placing orders now?
Yeah, in terms of stock and order times, we're actually in pretty good shape, Curtis. As I mentioned, we're an independent distributor, and with all of our production coming from Japan and Thailand, we do tend to maintain quite a strong level of buffer stock here in the UK. We'd actually increased our normal stock holding to mitigate against any supply chain disruption from Brexit. Remember that?
It's not gone away yet.
So our dealers, they can order from directly from the stock that we hold in Portbury. And now that the transportation services are all back, we can get a product prepped and delivered to them in most cases within 10 working days. So whilst I expect some OEMs are going to be challenged by their supply chains this year, with factories running at reduced capacity, I do think that the fact that we've got plenty of stock on the ground actually gives us, and likely to give us, a bit of an advantage in that area.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that showrooms reopened in England on the 1st of June. Then it was staggered across the rest of the UK. And you've mentioned, obviously, you know, the outstanding orders from March. And there's been a lot of conversation, a lot of talk around the pent-up demand, that increase in the sort of the first week's trading of June and throughout June. And, you know, what sort of feedback have you been getting from your dealers on, in terms of, you know, is it pent-up demand? Do they feel that demand will continue? And what's the consumer demand generally been like across the network?
Yeah, I mean, in June we saw 1,135 registrations here in the UK, and that was actually a little bit ahead of our revised plan, but about half what we saw in June last year. I was okay with that, to be honest, because last June we did some specific one-off fleet sales that we were never planning to repeat this year. In common with other brands, our dealers have been telling us that they're very busy on used and remain very busy on used, and they're kind of okay on new. You know, it's okay. It's not knocking the doors off, but it's reasonable levels. I think what will happen, of course, is this month and then critically September are going to give us a much clearer barometer of what the true market is, now that all the orders from March and the lockdown period have pretty much washed through. But the order levels and demand levels are reasonable. You know, dealers are telling us they're getting 80 to 90% of normal inquiry levels right now.
Yeah, and I mean, they say there, you mean, you know, we know that although England opened on the 1st of June, Scotland didn't, and neither did Wales. They were late, as well as Ireland. I mean, there was sort of 3 areas that were staggered after that. So June, as you say, isn't really the barometer, is it, for a true picture of the market?
No, it isn't. I mean, I think actually the June numbers were quite encouraging. The overall market performance, which was came in about 65% of prior year, was slightly better than our expectations. So I think it was a reasonable start back, but we're going to have to see how that develops over the next few months.
Now, Rob, you mentioned click and collect, and many brands and indeed dealer groups, some of which have been on the podcast, they've talked about how they've embraced online sales either before or during the lockdown. Some have actually brought forward programs that they were going to introduce later in the year. What is actually Mitsubishi's digital strategy, and has it actually changed as a result of the lockdown?
Well, Curtis, you might know that Mitsubishi was one of the first brands in the UK to actually launch a buy online platform way back in November 2017, before I actually joined the brand. So we treat that platform very much as an enabler. It gives customers choice and gives them some more flexibility, but it's there to support the dealers. And as I mentioned, a dealer is always involved in the handover process. And we very much leaned into that tool during the lockdown period, adding, as I mentioned, our free home delivery offer, which proved popular and gave customers the confidence to place orders when they're a bit uncertain about what they would be doing when the lockdown was in full force. So it's a very important tool for us and our dealer network, and it's certainly been something we were glad that we invested in and had available to us at this time.
And then do you expect it to be more in demand now that customers have got used to it? And most manufacturers are offering some sort of online service. Do you expect that to start growing significantly for the brand?
I think it'll grow for all brands. I mean, people have been talking about this for years, haven't they? And how online is going to take over the car industry. I'm a little bit on the fence on that one. I think that a blended format is going to remain quite important. I think customers enjoy that engagement with dealers. I think it's such an emotional and high value purchase that the retailer part in that is actually really critical, and I think will be for many years to come. So I think the online plays a very important part in the sales process, but I don't think in the foreseeable future it's going to replace the retailer, the dealer experience.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's that sort of cohesive approach between the two, that they say, that blended, having an online presence as well as that physical element. I think what this probably has done is brought forward, accelerated the need for having that both options available to the consumer, so that the consumer can choose which they want and have, like you say, a blended option of both. So in terms of, I mean, you've mentioned used cars there, and we've had people on the podcast previously talking about, obviously, the express focus on used cars as you mentioned Brexit before. We'll soon be back talking about that again soon enough, I suspect. But the new car market was a challenge pre-COVID in some areas, not just the UK, but there was WLTP, RDE, and everything else that was influencing the new car market. But there's this renewed focus on used cars and after sales. And how is the Mitsubishi network holding up with that? In terms of used car buoyancy and after sales strength across the network.
Yeah, Phil, I think our dealers have always focused very strongly on used cars, and actually particularly after sales. In fact, if you look at Mitsubishi dealers on average have really strong overhead absorption figures in excess of 80% absorption pre-COVID. And a key factor in that has always been the Mitsubishi service plan, where there's a penetration of almost 90% of eligible vehicle sales. So the after sales part of the business is definitely a strength of the franchise, and I think that will continue. Regarding used vehicle sales, I mean, during lockdown, there was a lot of nervousness, wasn't there? And uncertainty within the industry about what would happen to used car market and to used car values post-COVID, and whether those values would be impacted by distressed disposals. And of course, what we've actually seen, what's happened is almost the opposite. Consumer demand for used cars has remained very buoyant during the lockdown period. And our dealer used car website stats show that activity doubled in May versus April, and then in June returned to levels equal to last year. So there's definitely been a strong demand on used cars. We lean into that with our dealer network to help give the dealers confidence. We launched an SOR program for vehicles that we sell to them, which we announced at our virtual dealer conference at the end of May. And all of the cars and trucks that we made available for that were taken up almost immediately. So our dealers continue to report very strong demand for retail-ready franchise used cars across the range. Probably for us in the used car business, there's two standout performers. Firstly, we've got the Outlander PHEV, which has been more and more in demand as customers are embracing that change to ULEVs. And of course, it's also an affordable SUV with great environmental credentials. So as a used car, it ticks a lot of boxes, as it does as a new car. And then secondly, L200 pickup. And the demand for pickup has been particularly strong on the used side, actually, 75% higher than last year. So I think that's a signal that you've got SME-type customers coming back into the market and looking at affordable options that can work for them in the pickup space. So that's a very encouraging sign for us.
Yeah, I mean the LCV market really got going quicker than the car market. I think post lockdown, I think the figures seen through the LCV commercial vehicle market has been strong, and it hadn't shown signs of slowing down, I don't think, at the minute.
No, not at all.
Now, Rob, there's plenty of talk about whether the government should introduce another scrappage scheme or whether there should be a wider market stimulus, although I guess a VAT cut is looking unlikely now following this week's statement about VAT cuts across the hospitality sector. So that may not come into play. But what's your thinking about these suggestions in terms of getting customers thinking about buying again? What's your view on what's best for the market there?
Yeah, as we record this today, I was watching Rishi Sunak delivering his mini budget that isn't a budget at lunchtime, and I was hoping that we might get some good news from Rishi in terms of VAT, but clearly that was going to be for the hospitality sector and not for the automotive sector. We know that the SMMT has been lobbying hard with government for stimulus measures for the new car industry, and I fundamentally agree with that position. Although the June market did come in a little better than some expected, if we look at the calendar year to date, the market's still only half of what it was last year. With the sad likelihood of increased unemployment and a prolonged economic slowdown, I do think that something needs to happen, as it has, of course, in other European markets, to provide stimulus to this hugely important industry. Now, of course, just about every industry sector is looking for some form of stimulus and support. And the government noise is that they don't generally want to be too sector specific. But it certainly would be good to see some support. We would have all welcomed, I think, something like a VAT cut from 20% to 15% cut today, but that didn't happen. For me, I think the most important thing is that the government makes a decision on this quickly and makes its position clear. The worst possible thing that can happen is ongoing rumours of a potential scrappage programme that drag on and on, because that just simply provides a reason for customers to hold off and delay purchases, and that doesn't help anyone. So, I think it looks like there probably isn't going to be stimulus, and we're just going to have to get on with it. But let's hope that the government, makes its position very, very clear on that, and we don't have ongoing speculation. One thing that I do think really needs to happen is some flexibility on some of the regulations coming in this year, particularly on the derogation. We've got RDE Step 2 coming in for LCVs at the end of August, and we've got the next regulation for passenger cars coming in at the end of December. Inevitably, COVID-19 has disrupted supply chains and engineering plans, and both distributors like us and national sales companies almost certainly find themselves with a mix and profile of stock that they weren't expecting to have. So I think it's essential that the government applies some flexibility to the dates that models need to be sold by, and also to the levels of derogation being offered to brands. Otherwise, I think we run the risk of ending up with another really messy August and potentially a messy December. On top of all the current challenges we've got as an industry, frankly, nobody needs that. So I've been pushing quite hard with Mike Hawes at the SMMT, and I know he in turn has been pushing hard with the DFT on this particular topic. But we need a quicker and clearer response from government on that, in my opinion.
No, I'd agree with all of that, Rob. I think that a quick, clear decision, just get people back in the process of making their purchase decision is what's needed. And I think that's been echoed by many of the manufacturers in the UK. Just delays are just making confusion for many. I mean, finally, I'm just thinking from a crystal ball perspective. What are your hopes and expectations for Mitsubishi as a brand and the sector generally in the short, medium, and long term?
Well, yeah, it's a great question, Phil. I mean, Mitsubishi's a great brand with a history of innovation and great new products. And whether that's, if you look back at the Shogun or the Evo or L200 or the Outlander PHEV, Mitsubishi have got a great record of anticipating customer needs and trends and either creating or expanding new market segments. The challenge for Mitsubishi globally is that as a standalone vehicle manufacturer, that they didn't and they don't have the scale to be able to consistently develop new products and deal with some of the huge challenges of our industry, like electrification, climate change, and the general burden of regulation. And that's where I think the alliance with Nissan and Renault is of crucial importance. What that does is it gives Mitsubishi an effective scale, and therefore the ability to continue to invest in new products as part of one of the largest automotive groups in the world. So for us as an independent distributor here in the UK, my hope is that Mitsubishi will continue to produce great innovative products like the Outlander PHEV that define and develop new segments in the market. Clearly, Mitsubishi's defined its focus as being in the SUV space, the crossover space, 4x4 space with pickups, and a particular focus on PHEV technology. And these are all great places to be because they're segments of the market that are growing right now. So with that focus, and if the product pipeline continues, then I think the future can be bright for the brand. Turning to the industry, I've been in this industry for, over 30 years now. I think right now we're facing some of the greatest challenges we've seen in all that time. But it's a sector that has loads and loads of smart and passionate people. And I think we can overcome those challenges. Above all, I think this business should be nuts and bolts or printer paper. We're selling cars and trucks and motorbikes and things that give people a great deal of excitement and pleasure and make them happy. So if we can continue to try and have fun as a sector, as a business, and to provide that excitement and pleasure to our customers, then I think the future for the automotive sector is definitely still very bright.
I'd agree, and it's been fantastic having you on today, Rob. It's been a pleasure, and it's always good when you get somebody on that's an avid listener to the show as well, I think, more than anything else. But great roundup. As you say, fantastic loyal dealer network with Mitsubishi that is growing all the time, with additional dealers coming on board with Mitsubishi, and as you say, 80 plus overhead absorption, strong lineup of representation across the vehicle types. I think, as you say, there's a lot to look forward to. And as you know, 30 years in the industry, we've faced some challenges previously. We've always come through a resilient sector, aren't we, in terms of what we get through and what we've put up with, and will exist. So just to thank you for coming on today, Rob, and it's been a pleasure talking to you, really, and for you sharing your thoughts and views of the market.
Well, thanks, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure for me to talk with you and to be part of the show. So I really appreciate the time.
No, many thanks for joining us, Rob. Great to catch up with you again, and thanks for sharing your experiences and observations at this important time for car dealers. We wish you, your team, and the dealer network well over the coming months as we work through these challenging times. But unfortunately, that's all we've got time for now. You've been listening to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Please like and share on social media, as it's important during these times for the dealer community to continue to work together and share experiences and best practices. So many thanks to you for listening and supporting the podcast. Philip and I will be back with the industry headlines on Saturday, but do watch out for more special podcast interviews over the coming weeks. Until next time, stay safe and stay well.